great to be here. Yeah, I was delayed a couple of days due to John Key. They really do need to do something about the 757s, I have to say. I tried selling them a couple of 767s, which we're getting rid of, but they've now gone to Iceland Air. And they would have been good for the Air Force and comfortable for the Minister of... is this being recorded? I just saw a camera there, I hadn't seen that. I'll just back that particular bus up, actually. But no, it would have been good, but the reality is those aeroplanes have moved on now, and aeroplanes break down. I think it was just very unfortunate. They had 60-odd or 80-odd something, was it business people? And the upshot of it was that maybe they should have hired us, because the 787 can quite easily make India from Auckland non-stop. Doesn't have to refuel in Townsville and Singapore. So, sorry, I couldn't resist that. A little bit about high reliability. I think that's the point, isn't it? So thanks, Bob. I really appreciate the introduction. I've been with the firm 31 years. I'm the guy who remains constructively dissatisfied with the performance of the organisation and sit on the edge of my seat waiting for something to happen. And my role is attention to detail and making sure that things don't go wrong, and if they do go wrong, that we respond appropriately to them. I have been in Antarctica. I thought I'd just give you, there's a snap I took yesterday, just before we left the base at Scott Base down there. I don't know if any of you've been there or seen it, but that's looking out across, that's actually looking almost towards the south. Bob will know it well. That's White Island in the distance there, and just to the right of that is about 1,800 k's away is South Pole. It's the relatively closest part you can get to the South Pole by ship. That's why Scott and Shackleton both picked it, and that's the ice. That's the Ross Ice Shelf there, bigger than France. The actual Ross Ice Shelf. It's huge and it's teeming with life. We were out there. The reason I was down there is that we support climate change research down there. It's part of our long-standing commitment to Antarctica for obvious reasons. And the sustainability portfolio has a desire to deal with issues around carbon, because we are the largest single user of petroleum products in New Zealand on a daily basis. It's another part of my gig. So we have a huge weighting towards carbon in our business, and we want to know what can be done about it. So we're funding, and excuse me, you do get a dry, non-productive cough when you're down on the ice. It's the driest place in the world. It's actually technically a desert. The relative humidity is extremely low, and of course it was extremely cold. It's minus 45 at the pole at the moment. It was about minus 25 or so at Scott Base. It got up to about minus 15 there, and with a bit of wind, the temperature goes down very, very quickly. But what you're looking at there is McMurdo Sound. Another thing that I did while I was there, this was my 5th trip, so it's not a new thing for me, but obviously spend time contemplating the consequences of failure. And it's a good reminder. It was before my time, but the reality is it's a legacy that this airline and this nation has to acknowledge on the 28th of November every year. And while I was in Antarctica, over the last 5 days, I spent took occasion to go up to a memorial that we have adjacent to Scott Base. There's another one on the other side of the mountain. So that's actually looking north. Mount Erebus in the background, you can actually just see the tuft of volcanic smoke that comes out of it. It's an active volcano, one of 2 that are on the Antarctic continent, and there's a boiling lava lake inside the mountain. You can actually, if you fly over it, you can look down and see it. And that's a sculpture by Phil Price. There's a facsimile of that up on the mountain, which is actually hollow, and has got messages from all of the families actually inside it. Consecrated ground. The Dean of Christchurch Cathedral, Peter Beck, did that, and whenever I'm there, I spend some time up there. Of course, you've got to have the snaps, don't you? So that's the emperor penguin. That's how close they'll get to you. You stand there. If you stand still, or stand up and stand still and pretend you're a penguin, they'll get quite close to you. They'll actually peck away at your salopettes, your overtrousers. They're about that high, so they're a big bird, and there you go. You get down and get low, that's the sort of photographs you get. And that's just, I thought I'd throw that in, because after morning tea, you need something to get you going, don't you, And that's Shackleton's Hut at Cape Royds. So we were there, we visited Shackleton's Hut and then Scott's Hut as well, before we actually did the work that we had to do, which was actually check out some guys who were diving under the ice. Could you imagine that? Diving under, it's like Omen, but these guys are down in a dry suit under the ice and what have you. But you can see all the food. So the huts have been conserved. I should have thrown a photograph of the inside, but the huts are all conserved. They're like a living museum. You walk in there, the things on the shelf that were there when they walked out in 1908. And you can see around the hut, you can see all the food there. There's the dog kennels around the side. There's, Shackleton, I don't know what he was thinking, but he actually took a Model T Ford down there. So he was planning to drive, but it didn't happen. So what do we do in Air New Zealand? My gig is making sure, and the purpose of this conversation today is to give you an insight into how the aviation system works. We'll then focus a little bit on Air New Zealand, and then I want to talk a little bit, about trust and responsibility, and why it's so important, and how we maintain it from a business perspective. So my gig is safe, sustainable, and exceptional customer journeys. You'll notice the word customer. So I'm making the assumption as a client of the health system that you think in terms of me as being your customers. Customer centricity. Businesses that flourish and grow will always work on the concept of a strong culture. With customer centricity will deliver outcomes, and in our case, obviously, commercial outcomes. So this concept of a cultural, a strong culture focusing on customer centricity will deliver the outcomes that you want. So it's extremely important to me, and I'll talk a little bit about just culture a little bit, and I assume this may well have been touched on. It's extremely important process, but also tenet in the aviation system to keep it safe, and we'll come back to focusing on the customer as a result of that. We do it over quite a technological spectrum. So there's a picture of a Q300 there from Air Nelson, through to something like, iFly, which is a Boeing 78. What are you on at the moment, Bob? You still on the bus? Oh, Jesus. Okay. All right. Well, it'll come. But the upshot of it is the Boeing 787. The world's most modern airliner, along with the Airbus A350, which I heard yesterday Cathay brought into the country. Both of them are great aircraft. These are aeroplanes that are they're not made out of metal, so they're made out of composite material. The engines on that thing are $33 million each. So they're not cheap. They're an expensive asset, and we have to extract the maximum amount of value we can out of them. They don't make any money sitting on the ground. But the reality is that what we do, and this is the sort of scale of what we do every day. So in New Zealand, typically we'll do something like 600, just over 600 flights a day. It varies depending on the day of the week and, of course, the time of the year. We move typically around about 40,000 passengers, a little less in the middle of the week, and in the weekends it's a bit busier. Many of those passengers are now a cross-section of the community. Once upon a time, I know some of the older folk in the room will recall their parents putting on a tie, and an appropriate frock to go. Not your father putting on a tie and a frock, I don't know about that, but anyway. But putting on the appropriate gear to go flying. It's now commoditised, isn't it? You can buy the thing on the phone, you can check in on the phone, you can sit down in the aeroplane, not use your phone, which is always a good thing, and go to sleep and you wake up in another city or maybe another country. So the reality is it's a very agnostic to the strata of the community, if I can put it that way. The reality is that everybody flies. It's a cross-section of the community. I don't know what the percentage of people in this community are drug and alcohol dependent, but probably 4% or something like that. And so as a consequence of that, 4% of people on the aeroplane are probably in that boat. You know what I mean? We'll have older folk, we'll have infirm people, we'll have youngsters. For the first 4 days and the last 4 days of the school holidays, we will typically have 200 unaccompanied minors. which is almost a commentary on the social status of the country. But the reality is we have a whole lot of different people flying with us. We move 510,000 kilograms of bags, of course, all of them weighing less than 28 kilos. Yeah, right. 89 of those will unfortunately be mishandled. 88 will be returned within 24 hours, and 1 will go to a place that elephants go to die. We move 365 tonnes of cargo, 365 tonnes of cargo a day, and that varies. We do a lot of anything from, well, I took off out of Nandi a couple of weeks ago. I recall 16 tonnes of tuna, 8 tonnes of live coral, and 6 tonnes of taro. The tuna goes to Japan, the live coral goes to America, and the taro basically gets taken over to Australia, turned into some sort of starch over there. But we do a lot of medical stuff. We don't have to carry dangerous goods, but the reality is we do. And a lot of that, in actual fact, is for the medical fraternity. The mail, of course, and as I said before, we use a lot of fuel, 3.1 million litres per day, 185,000 litres per hour. So it's a reasonable amount, and it's costs a lot of money. The framework that we work under, and this is probably a bit different to your system, is very, very regulated. We are extremely regulated industry, and that regulation is delivering, it's good regulation. It delivers very good outcomes to us. So the International Civil Aviation Organisation, or ICAO, was formed actually in it was after Hui in Chicago in 1944, at the end of the war in Europe. And in 1947, they got together, this is the nations, the states of the world, to regulate civil aviation in the world. And in 1947, they formed ICAO and handed the whole thing over to the United Nations. So the reality is that civil aviation in the world is actually controlled through an organ of the United Nations. It's a bit like the World Postal Union or the World Telegraph Union. There are a number of systems that work underneath the auspices of the UN, and ICAO is one of them. And I'll tell you a story about how well it works. See, I'm taking off, I don't know if you ever did this, Bob, but you take off in 777 from Hong Kong to London, right? And I'm flying an American airplane that's fitted with an American device called an altimeter, which measures the weight of the atmosphere above it, and it's sort of, you can convert that into altitude, and so it tells you your height. The problem is that when you're flying in from China to the UK, you've got to go through China and then Russia and a few other stans and that sort of thing. And they tend to use meters. So I've got an American altimeter that's calibrated in feet, but I've got to convert it to meters. And in fact, I do that by pressing a button. The route that you take takes you straight over the top of Moscow. And then coming the other way is Ivan. So Ivan is taken off in his Aleutian. Great airplane, nothing wrong with it. And he's using a Kalashnikov altimeter, designed by the Kalashnikov Altimeter Company of Belarus, or Minsk in Belarus. And, guess what? It's calibrated in meters, because they use meters as their standard. We use feet. And undoubtedly, he presses a button as well, which converts his meters into feet, and mine's gone from feet to meters. And of course, hopefully we're using the right length of a metre, because, I'm sure you know the original length of a metre was 1/10 millionth of the distance between the equator and the pole. That is actually what a metre is. But the Chinese use a slightly different metre to the Russians, believe it or not. And then eventually we'll all go on to feet. But in the middle of the night, when I'm sleeping the sleep of the innocent, up in the bunk upstairs in the 777, which is in the ceiling, and Ivan's probably doing the same thing, because it's really good for old captains like us to have a good sleep in the middle of the night. And you get the young guys flying the airplane through sailing through the ether, and we're going to be sound asleep, and we'll sail past each other 300 metres apart. Hopefully not at the same height, but he's up there and I'm here, or vice versa. And the reason it works is because the guy who built, maintains, fitted, and operates the Kalashnikov altimeter, and the guy who built, maintains, fitted, and operates the Honeywell or the American altimeter, are both using the same book. It's published by ICAO. It's called the Standard of Recommended Practices, and these SARPs define the thickness of a runway, the quality of a pilot's medical, the navigation aids, how you build an aircraft, how you maintain an altimeter. And so it's extremely buttoned down and extremely regulated. But the thing is, you'd think, well, shit, with all that regulation, typically that will constrain things from moving forward. But it doesn't. It means that we're all playing in the same sandpit and we're all working on the same wavelength. We've got some tertiary legislation in New Zealand, which is the Civil Aviation Act, and that act is actually quite useful because the act not only defines what you can and can't do, and by the way, it says the operator shall or the pilot command shall not. So it's very, very high level sort of regulation. It does not get down to a level of granularity. There's a lot of alternative forms of compliance to the rules. But the reality is with that overarching ICAO regulation, which states sign up to, and then tertiary legislation sitting underneath that, and an act in New Zealand that is not just about what you can and can't do, but also has a requirement to promote air commerce, because it recognises that in an isolated island destination that we live in, and air commerce is an important thing, it does work. We've got a couple of other things that help us to make things work, the government policy and legislation. So there's a New Zealand Aviation State Safety Program. We also have a safety management system process, don't need to go into. Standard stuff, you know, high level, and you work your way through it. It's SMS 101. Don't want to really spend too much time on that. But here's the kicker. The whole thing adds up to a system that recognises that you're dealing with risk, all right? And the risk, the acceptable level of risk in the aviation system, is there anybody here who's a little worried about flying? Okay, roger that, got it. Okay, the acceptable level of risk is 10 to the power of -9 of a catastrophic failure of the system per flight hour. And if I don't know what the answer is on a particular day, I'll ask somebody to tell me what the number is for some sort of activity. So I've got guys, risk guys, whose job it is to make sure that they know what activity I'm undertaking and that it's going to be better than that number. And if they can't work it out, then I send the whole lot off to the University of Auckland Mathematics Department and some real cone heads over there. They work it out and send it back to me. So I don't stand at the end of the air bridge and say, good luck, hope it goes well, 1 in a billion chance of the whole thing going tango uniform, because a 10 to the power of -9 is an acceptable level of risk. Because if I didn't want to take that risk, never get out of bed. Because we are in the business of opposing the force of gravity. That's fundamentally what you do. That 787 I showed you, 300 tonne of aeroplane. And it's what's supporting it, of course, is the flow of air over its airfoil surfaces. That's what keeps it in the air, not the engines. It's the flow of air over the wing that keeps that aeroplane up there. And it works really well. Half the world's population will travel by air this year. The equivalent of half the world's population travels by air. There's something like 49,000 commercial flights every day with a whole lot of people on them. And that adds up to a lot of many billions of people who will travel, and very few of them will have negative outcomes. Isn't that interesting? When you compare it to other forms of transport or other activities. So that's the high-level industry perspective, highly regulated, etc. As far as Air New Zealand is concerned, if I can just shift gears here, you have to understand that our role as a business is to make money. That's what we are. We are a commercial organisation. We make that money by providing transport and tourism to people who live in this world, in New Zealand, I should say, and live around the world. There's a thing called VUCA. You can Google it. It's quite interesting. It's an American US military came up with it. It's the concept of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It actually creates opportunity. You could actually think of it in terms of very negative, but it means that you shape your business up knowing that there's always going to be change. There's going to be influences that are going to try and drive change. You're going to have to make decisions on the basis that there's going to be a certain level of uncertainty about the outcome, that we live in a complex world, and there is a reasonable amount of ambiguity about VUCA. And I do suggest you have a look at it. And we frame our thinking up as an organisation in this context, because the reality is organisations need to be mobile. They need to be able to change because things are changing. Technology is making things change. Do you know when you look like the kind of guy who would know when an iPhone first came to market. Do you know what the answer to that is? You don't look old enough, actually, but what do you reckon? 2007. So 9th of January 2007 is when Steve Jobs stuck up on the stage and he said, here's the iPhone. Isn't that incredible? 2007, that's only 9 years ago. You know, but you think it was a lot longer. Do you know what I mean? And the technology curve is going like that. It's the old story. It's either be disrupted or do the disrupting. And technology is doing the disrupting. Don't let me start on drones, you know, because I'm the drone guy as well, not only in New Zealand but in the world. And having had a look at Google X and seen the driverless car, take driverless cars. Sorry, I'm going off track. I am off-piste. Bob will bring me in. But you take a driverless car. We went up to Google and saw the car and saw what it can do. It does 1 million data points a second. That's how much, far more effective than this thing in delivering the outcome. If they don't crash, they don't have to be crash-worthy. If they're not crash-worthy, they can go they can be a fifth the weight, and if they're a fifth the weight, they go 5 times the distance on the same amount of fuel. Think about it. A third of the world's cities is given over to vehicles. If you could press the button, have a driverless electric vehicle turn up and take you to where you want to go, and when it was finished, park yourself. Why have I got $100,000 worth of motor vehicles sitting out there for 20 minutes a day? Why is that? I don't know. You know, so the reality is that's the way of the world. And my daughter, you go to Colmar Brunton, work out what young people want to spend their money on. They don't want to spend it on buying cars. So that's a disruptive technology that's coming to the motor vehicle industry. That technology will come to the aviation industry eventually as well. I'm assuming people are thinking in terms of artificial intelligence and robotics and surgery. You know, that it's got to be happening. There's no doubt about it. Okay, another thing we have is, of course, our business principles. I don't want to spend too much time on that. So we're in a VUCA environment. We've got overlay that some basic principles of our organisation, which drives our culture. And we also think very deeply about change, all right? And that's actually required by law in the aviation industry. So you don't make change without thinking deeply about it, and particularly around the risk that you're going to take. The other thing for our organisation is that safety, people safety and operational safety sit side by side. Okay, they're very closely aligned together. And the reason for that is that people safety typically comes out of an OSH way of thinking, and that's all about compliance. And if you start with compliance, bad news, because you get compliance mentality, and so making sure that we tick the box. And the one thing you never do, and I'm hoping you guys don't, is that's incentivise people to get good OSH outcomes. Because if you do, the guys will be gaming the system, all right? Especially if you're incentivising them to do that. Air New Zealand does not do that. Do you know what we saw? Our TRR rate going up because people were not frightened to tell us that they had a problem, but the severity going down because we're actually dealing with the issues. So the TRR rate, which is a really bad lag indicator, is actually gone up, and we're happy about that because we get better reporting and we see what the problem is. Now we're dealing with it, and the severity of those things have gone down. Goes to our reporting culture. So people safety and operational safety sit alongside each other. And on our safety journey, have you seen this thing? It's called the DuPont-Bradley curve. And it takes us on a journey, and I'll very quickly go over it. Think in terms of seat belts. So when I was a kid in the Falcon 500, my parents put me in a car seat that was simply hooked over the front bench seat, right? Remember that? All right? Quite happily sitting hooked over the front, and God, thank God the car never went very fast, so, you know, and Dad was a reasonably good driver. So, you know, you relied on luck, all right? Then somebody said, you've got to wear seatbelts. So you relied on the government to tell you. Then you get into a car nowadays and you just put the seatbelt on without even thinking about it, all right? And you know you've really got it when the kids tell you to put your seatbelt on. Do you know what I mean? And so that's that journey, you know, reactive, dependent, independent, and interdependent across the bottom here. I depend on luck, I depend on you, I depend on me, we depend on each other. The journey that Air New Zealand's taking, we're sitting in about here at the moment, so the left-hand side of the I depend on me. And one of the big challenges, of course, is somebody like me saying to somebody, hey, look, you shouldn't be crossing here. Well, let's cross the road further down where there's a set of lights. You know what I mean? And so we're creating the culture that it will actually enable people to talk about that. DuPont did this work. It's called the Bradley curve. They blew up an explosive factory last century, killed a whole lot of people. The DuPont family were extremely perturbed about it because they were isolated locations and the factory was, the town, and the town blew up. One of the interesting things is after that they decided to make the manager's office sit on top of the pile of dynamite. It's a true story. And as a result of that, they haven't had a factory blow up since. Right. And a big thing for us, of course, is we're into mindfulness. So mindful leadership, and we spend a lot of time talking about making people mindful of, it's situational awareness basically is the aeronautical term, but having this value where we all look out for each other, so hugely important. Not into compliance-based management of people safety, and the other benefit that you get is the good thing about operational safety is that we get to root cause quite quickly. So guy broke his ankle. Why did he break his ankle? Oh, because he tripped over the hose in the hangar. Why did okay, so Osh would say tripped over the hose in the hangar, so they should have put something down to stop him from tripping over the hose, end of thing. No, operational safety says, well, why was the hose there? Oh, well, because the plane was here, it was not over in that hangar. Why was the plane in this hangar and not that hangar, which is the proper hangar it was supposed to be in? Oh, well, it wasn't over there because we haven't replaced some gear that we should have replaced. You see what I'm getting at here? So the problem was actually the system had failed to deliver the outcome that caused that guy to trip over the hose. And so that's root cause analysis. I know this has probably been touched on. James Reason talks about just culture, an atmosphere of trust in which people are encouraged for providing essential safety-related information, but in which they are clear about whether a line must be drawn between acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. The next one is Lucian Lippe, who's the professor of Harvard School of Public Health. I thought I'd pull this up for you. The single greatest impediment to error prevention in the medical industry is that we punish people for making mistakes. That's his view of the world. And then the third one is Don Norman, who wrote a very good book, The Design of Everyday Things. People make errors which lead to accidents. Accidents lead to deaths. The standard solution is to blame the people involved. The problem is seldom the fault of the individual. It is the fault of the system. Change the people without changing the system and the problems will continue. So the reality is we need to recognise that there is a requirement to have a cultural within your organisation that manages safety accordingly. And this graph simply talks about your support for the system's safety and the continuum with regard to reporting. So if you've got a laissez-faire, no blame, no shame, hate that view, those words, you're sitting over here, back, your arms behind your head, leaning back in your chair saying you don't care. Over here, if you punish people for telling you that it's got a problem, likewise, you get very low support for the system. What you've got to find is the sweet spot in here. Now, this can get down to quite a very, very granular level. So when I go flying, I'm the chief pilot for Air New Zealand. I'm not the most senior pilot, but clearly I'm the chief, and quite often I'll fly with one of the most junior guys in the airline. I flew with him the other day, and you could see he was nervous. The first thing I had to do was give him the gift of disabusing him of the notion that he could not criticise my performance. In fact, I expected it. Because I said to him, hey, I'm going to make mistakes today. Our job as a team is to capture those mistakes and make sure that we manage them and deal with them. I make heaps of mistakes, but it's so important for me, and Bob will do the same when he's flying with a brand new person. Say, I expect you to tell me when we're not tracking correctly, or I intend to fly the aeroplane in a standard way, and if I'm not doing that, that means that it's not intentional, and I'm making a mistake. And so you need to tell me. So, because the reality is, if you're not only letting me down, but do you know who you're letting down? The 300 people who are sitting behind us. Because we just fly this little room around. Everybody else seems to come along for the ride. That's the reality. And we can get us also into groupthink. That's another thing, where you get 3 or 4 of us on the flight deck, and we all think, and we're solution biased, so we want to get the outcome that we want, and we lose sight of the position that we're in. So this concept of just culture, which says I'm going to respect you and not punish you for telling me that I've got a problem. Now, do you think that happens in the operating theatre at all the time? So my wife, she used to paediatric oncology. She was charge nurse at Princess Mary in the old days, paediatric oncology, spinal unit, national women's, public health, vaccination, just retired as school nurse at Auckland Grammar School. But in her early days at Cherry Farm and did a bit of theatre work down in Dunedin and that sort of thing, was right on the receiving end of Mr. So-and-so telling her that she had no right to tell him that he was going to sew something up inside the patient. You know what I mean? And so you can tell there that the command gradient was all wrong, the atmosphere was all wrong. And I know it has shifted because we do work, don't we, Bob, with the College of Surgeons and doing stuff like this that we're here today. But I just cannot emphasise it enough. And the reality is, in the just culture, it's our legal requirement, believe it or not. The regulations, the ICAO regulations and the New Zealand regulations actually require this. So it's not just some good idea. The reality is now embedded in the law. And of course the lawyers hate it because it means you don't go after the person. And then I'll just finally just talk about the last part of that. So we never punish human error and we never punish at-risk behaviour. Because at-risk behaviour is simply typically will be somebody's wanting to do the right thing for the wrong outcome or for the wrong reason, you know. We had an aeroplane the other day damaged where a guy came out and hit the side of it. And of course, everybody's running around with their hair on fire because the aeroplane was badly damaged. It was, it's at least a couple of $1 million worth of damage to the aircraft, just nudged it because it's a monocoque construction. And the reality is, so the strength is in the shell. And sack him, get rid of him. No, hang on, let's get to let's ask the question, why? Why did he crash going too fast? Why was he going too fast? Well, he's wanting to get the bags out to get it out on time. That's the fundamental issue, you know. So he was under a false impression of what success looked like. You know what I mean? Trying to balance the two out. So we never punish or human error or at-risk behaviour. We console or coach. The only time we get into any sort of pejorative process is with reckless behaviour. So that's the framework, okay? Now, for a business to be successful, you've got, our view is in Air New Zealand, for a business to be successful, you have to have a higher purpose, all right? Viktor Frankl worked on this space. Have you ever read that book, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl? And the reality is strong businesses need strong communities and strong communities need strong businesses. Our purpose in Air New Zealand is to supercharge New Zealand's success socially, economically and environmentally. That is what we do. That is our purpose. Our promise is to connect New Zealanders with each other and New Zealand with the world through a liberating travel experience. So this is the why, the what and the how. And our objective is to create a world-class organisation delivering cultural, customer and commercial excellence. That's our business plan. That's it. It's a one-pager and all the staff have that and they know how they connect with that higher purpose. And it actually drives the way Air New Zealand as an organisation thinks and operates. And there's sort of 5 pillars that sit underneath that. But I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that as an organisation, you have to have a higher purpose to deliver that outcome. And this is where we get into the concept of responsibility and trust. And the reality is there are some others, leadership and fairness. Air New Zealand doesn't particularly rate highly on fairness, and the reason for that is it's perceived about price. And of course, what people don't understand is that it's extremely expensive to fly an aeroplane around, and sometimes we can't deliver the price expectations that people have these days. But with regard to leadership, responsibility and trust, we rate very highly, and in fact, with regard to responsibility and trust, we are rated as the highest organisations in the world, in New Zealand, I'm sorry. The reality when it comes to trust, there is a correlation between trust and advocacy. So being honest and ethical in the way you do business and having a positive impact on safety. And trust builds reputation, and so that's where the payback lies. And so the reality is the greater the trust, the greater number of advocates you'll have with your organisation, and it is a bit self-fulfilling as well. Now, how do you deal with it when it all goes wrong? All right, and I'll come back to the Colmar Brunton stuff at the end. So we deal with stuff all the time. Every day there's something goes on in our business. When you've got 104 aircraft in the fleet doing 600 flights a day in this process of opposing the force of gravity, there is going to be something that's going to come at you. And I've just thrown a few up there just from the 2001 to the 2010. You can see Ansett, that was September the 12th, the day before September the 11th. So September 2001 was a fairly busy year. Busy month. You have SARS, we have bird flu, we have earthquakes, we have aeroplanes that don't seem to want to have its wheels go down, we have hijackings, we have Perpignan, we had swine flu, we had guys who went missing, one of my colleagues in Hong Kong, and I just give that as an example. In the bottom right-hand corner is Pike River. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, it's extremely important that airlines understand that if you don't manage your reputation, if you're not considered to be trusted or trustworthy, then you will fail. And I'll tell you the story about this organisation called ValueJet. ValueJet was a low-cost carrier. I hope you're finding this interesting. A low-cost carrier, but not a low-value, not a low-quality carrier. And so the reality here with ValueJet is that they had a situation where chemical oxygen generator. When the flap opens up and all of a sudden you have to pull down the mask and pull the pin and the oxygen will flow. What you're actually doing there, just for your benefit, is you're firing a little squib, a little explosive charge, and there's two chemicals in that, iron pyrite and something else. I don't know what it is, Condes crystals or something. And there's an exothermic reaction. Oxygen is produced and also heat, and you get 12 minutes of oxygen. And it's not because there isn't any oxygen at altitude. Below 60 kilometres, the reality is the distribution of gases is more or less homogeneous. So there's plenty of oxygen up there. It's just the molecular or the partial pressure of oxygen is insufficient for it to cross the membrane of the lungs. So you've got to go into an oxygen-rich environment. So that's why you put an oxygen mask on. And in the meantime, the aeroplane is descended down to a lower altitude where you can take it off. And you've got 12 minutes of that stuff. But as I said, it was an exothermic reaction, and so what actually happened was a box of these things were put onto that ValueJet aircraft. One went off, they all went off, the wings came off, and the airplane ended up in a field in Florida, and that's it. That's the memorial there, and the whole thing ended up in a backyard of some a field there, and what have you. Now, ValueJet went out of business 6 months later because they didn't manage their reputation and they didn't manage their share price. And what do you think it was that they didn't manage well killed them? It was their reaction to the people. You see what I mean? So they're dealing with the family. We're seeing it today with Dreamworld, aren't we? We're seeing it today with the Dreamworld one. You have to front. You have to front, and you have to front with the families. This concept of doing it long distance through the police. I don't want to be too critical of Dreamworld because I'm only reading what I read in the media, and what I read in the media is only half the story. So there's that aspect of it. But the reality is this organisation went out of business because it didn't manage its reputation and its share price, and that was as a direct consequence of the fact of its way of dealing with the people who were involved in that accident. So a big part of what we do is managing that process, and we have a process in Air New Zealand for events. Either catastrophic events, business continuity events, weather events, bomb threats. We get a few of those regularly. It's a great way of actually holding an airplane up so you can get on it if you're running late. But we track you down, we hunt you down, I tell you. There's a court case, and there's a court case coming up in Victoria, in Australia at the moment, and I hope that we'll get a good outcome from that. But we have a process. What do you think is the timeline for the first press release to go out? What do you think? To see the first press release. Christopher Luxon and I see the first press release. So the balloon goes up as a process. What do you think that timeline is?
30 minutes?
No. 3. 3 minutes for the draft to be in front of us, and the first one to go out at 10 minutes. Okay, so that's the sort of pace, because if you have a vacuum of information, then that vacuum will be filled by somebody else. And that sort of thing. And so it's all just a run sheet, and we practice it and what have you. But the whole purpose of this process is not to show that we are in control or we are in charge because we'll make mistakes. It's to make sure that we are actually connecting to the community and particularly to the people. And I just wanted to talk about one thing. I'll just make sure I'll talk about Pike River in a minute. But the whole purpose is readiness, response, and recovery. And I know I'm getting into a bit of detail here, but this goes to the concept of trust. It goes to this concept of responsibility. Organisations need processes like this to deliver outcomes that would ensure that they remain above the line and successful. So readiness, response, and recovery are systems that's prepared, capable, and tested. Tactical versus strategic outcomes. It's really interesting, actually, when we have an event, we split into two as an executive. So I deal with the operational side of it, and Chris and the rest of the team deal with the tactical. Their job is not to deal with the event. So you do not want your CEO, is there any CEOs in here? I think there are, aren't there? So I assume that you will not have anything to do with a tactical emergency event that's occurring within your organisation, the tactical aspect of it. Do you know why? If you are worrying about the tactical stuff, you have lost sight of your strategic objectives, is to make sure you've got an organisation at the end of the day, at the end of the month, at the end of the year. So what Christopher Luxon does, and the rest of the organisation, is actually think in terms of the high-level strategic outcomes, while I deal with the tactical delivery outcomes on how many ambulances, who's been injured, where is the plane, who's going to the hospital, etc., all that sort of stuff. If we have a situation where members of the executive ring up saying how many ambulances are, what I do is I have a mandate to actually push back and say no, don't go there. That's not your responsibility. I can give you a briefing in half an hour on that if you really want it, but can you just confirm with me that we're still going to have a business? Because guess what? 104 aircraft in the fleet, we're now got 103. The 103 aircraft that are still in the fleet still deserve the same amount of mindfulness that we had before the event occurred. And guess what? CEOs have got to then create that outcome. And it's very hard when a business is highly distracted to do that. And so what actually happens is, in the case of Air New Zealand, the executive pick up different roles. So Bruce Parton probably come out with me and deal with the operational side of the business, where Rob McDonald, who's normally the CFO, well, he'll pick up a whole other part of the business, and we divvy up the responsibilities among the executive. So I'll just give you an insight into that. The other thing too is the concept of getting alongside the families, the victims. This is hugely important. This is actually in terms of Pike River. And so when Pike River occurred, the chairman of Pike River rang John Palmer, who was our chairman at the time, who rang Rob Fife, who rang me, and said, can we support? And what we have in Air New Zealand is 550 staff who are trained as victim support. And their job is to get alongside the families. And so we had 18 down there on the first day and the remaining 6 there the next day. And they were there for 3 months. And so Air New Zealand, and you won't have heard about this, so we don't talk about it. So Air New Zealand had 23 or 24 of its staff in Pike River for 3 months. And we didn't ask for money. This is about social, economic, and environmental. This is our social responsibility aspect. As another business, doesn't matter about the cause of the accident, it was fairly suboptimal, as we all know, but the reality is it was all about the victims and the people associated with that. And we actually do this for a number of we've done it for other firms as well, and that sort of thing. So here's the learning. The aviation system, and in Air New Zealand, we exist in a strong regulatory environment. We accept that, but it doesn't constrain us. We have extremely close relationships. Very interesting, isn't it? There's a large food producing company in New Zealand who had an event with a pipe that was dirty. The trick there is they did not want to bring their regulator into the process. You've got to work with your regulator, because they're the guys who are going to make sure that you're going to stay in business. So the idea that you'd be standoffish with the regulator and I don't think they were, but they just didn't quite know how to connect. So extremely important to have close relationships with your regulator. We work on a basis of risk. We have a well-defined system. It's extremely well articulated. We have an exposition, which sort of says what we're doing and how we're doing it. An embedded just culture, something that's tested regularly, and of course customers are at the core. And what does that result in? I'll just talk about the 3 lessons or the 3 learnings. So how do you build a strong reputation? By earning trust. The most trusted brands consistently deliver on the promise they make to their customers. So the reality is, what is your promise? What is your higher purpose? Do you deliver on it, and do you deliver it consistently? More and more, this promise extends to making a difference in the world. That's the social piece, not just the category they operate in. And it's for that reason that Air New Zealand and Toyota, Alistair Davis, I'm the Deputy Chair of the Sustainable Business Council, and Alistair's the Chair of that, and he's number 2 at the moment. He's a bit annoyed. And you've got Z Energy, AA, and New Zealand Post. So that's where Air New Zealand sits. The next thing too is how do you build a strong reputation, is don't window dress. People will condemn the cover-up more than the transgression. It's quite interesting, actually, that this comes out in the research. Don't try and sugarcoat it. And the third one is corporation and brand are becoming one. Their reputation will reinforce or erode each other. So if you have an organisation with a higher purpose and you have a brand, this will grow. And you can see some of those brands there: Nestle, Unilever, Procter & Gamble and Microsoft. They are more than just companies, they are brands in their own right. And that all adds up to the concept. Do you do this, Bob? Are you into this?
It doesn't freak me out.
Oh. And so this is why I sleep the sleep of the innocent. When the aeroplane's threading its way through the hills at Queenstown at night, this is looking through the head-up display that we use, so the pilots can manage their energy at night going into Queenstown, knowing that it's a layered system, that it has a quality process that runs all the way through it, that it completely trusting each other with mindful leadership and a just culture that I know that people will feel free to put their hand up to make the system better. And what all this adds up to is, when we are taking risk, when we fly the aeroplane at night into Queenstown, I will sleep the sleep of the innocent knowing that the passengers are going to be delivered to their destination safely. Any questions? Yes?
Thanks very much, David Grayson, Surgeon from Auckland. I was just interested in your ability for protection, and particularly just noticing recently on some flights I've done, an increase in turbulence.
Right.
Can you maybe give us a heads up on how good you are able to predict turbulence? And as sort of a side question of it, are we actually seeing more turbulence?
Yeah, so we are seeing more turbulence. So the atmosphere is quite energetic at the moment. So the atmosphere is a huge heat engine. And apart from the change of seasons where you get more energy transfer in the atmosphere, we were discussing it actually the other day in Beijing. I was at an IATA meeting, and the view is that there is a bit more turbulence about at the moment, and whether it's related to solar activity, because we're in the sunspot spot cycle, and that sort of thing. How do we predict it? It's quite hard. Clear air turbulence is very hard to predict or see, but there are some very good models now, and new technologies that are coming through all the time. We're actually an early adopter of a new one, which is actually delivering some really good results. But the reality is that's off data. So if you're wanting to predict, we predict when parts on an aircraft will fail, and we do that by, and this is all about reliability data, and so we remove the part before it fails, and we do that by monitoring its performance. And so you can apply that, obviously, in other ways as well. But to answer your question, the atmosphere is a little bit more energetic at the moment, so there is a bit more turbulence about. It's not that hard to predict, but you've got to use technology and new tools to do it. Any other questions?
Maybe just one more question before we move on.
12:15, I was supposed to finish then anyway, so that's all right.
Hi, Helen Mason from Bay of Plenty.
Cool.
You spoke about the work that you're doing with the College of Surgeons.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Bob could probably talk more about that than me, but fundamentally it's the concept of just culture, and it's the concept of that command gradient, that creating the environment within that operating theatre or that work environment that makes people feel part of a team who are equally weighted and who are all focused on the customer outcome or the patient outcome in the case of the College of Surgeons. And it's coming into a whole lot of other industries, stand-up team talks prior to the start of the day. What is our objectives? What are our limitations? What are we dealing with? all that sort of thing, you know. So it's just that sort of stuff, and it's been going on for a number of years now. Yeah. Keith Petrie, actually, at the Auckland School of Medicine is probably somebody you might want to talk to. He can tell you about it, and certainly Bob knows about it as well. So thanks very much. It's been great talking to you. I hope you've got a little bit of insight as to the way Air New Zealand operates, and I hope you can take some of the learnings and maybe think about how they might apply to your own businesses. Thank you.
David, thank you.